we are going to do Assetto Corsa. Okay, perfect. So, Clinic 2. For those of you that didn't catch Clinic 1, I have posted the a little bit shortened recording of that. As many of you will know, I forgot to hit record last time. I have made sure I hit record this time, so we should be good to go. But the first section of that I recorded just last night and posted this morning, so you guys can go and follow up on that if you didn't see it or weren't here. Now into Clinic 2. Actually, you know what? Before I start, does anybody have any questions that came up while practicing or things they want clarified from last week?
Not that I can think of.
Cool. Okay, sounds good. Well, if anything comes up, feel free to shout it out. But for now, I guess I'm just going to play this for some background, but we'll get going. So basically, today will be hopefully a little bit shorter because I know it was quite heavy last week, but we're just going to go into a few more techniques that do with braking, basically the initial phase of braking, and how we can continue to shorten that distance at every corner, and also get more consistent. So I think the first thing that I'm gonna go over is, I can't decide, but I think we'll go with braking markers. And it's really not too long, but I want to point something out to you guys, and I kind of mentioned it in passing last week, but specific braking markers are really, really important. It tells us when we're going to brake at every single corner, and it tells us exactly what spot to brake in, and I think maybe they're probably the best determiner of consistency that we're going to get during braking, because they're things that don't move, and they're really obvious, like they're visual, right? It's not some sort of input that we have to, hit 95% every time. We can just see the 300 meter board, for example, and brake at that, and be really consistent. And that's where it all starts, is our braking marker. Now we all kind of know the obvious stuff, and actually this track is maybe not the best example, but we'll go through it anyway. But the idea is, when you're picking a brake marker, first of all, we want something that doesn't move. You've probably heard that a ton before, but I just want to reiterate, shadows, temporary skid marks, anything like that, if that's going to be moving throughout the session, or disappearing for that matter, that's going to be a really big issue, because you don't want to come around to the lab and be like, oh, I no longer know where to brake. Beyond that, however, we can get a little bit more technical, and we can start trying to figure out more optimal braking markers, because a lot of the time, and in this track we're actually really lucky. I'm going to use Laguna Seca, I think, probably throughout the series. As I mentioned, I really like it as a kind of learning track. It's got a little bit of everything. But at Laguna, we have these really awesome markers, basically distance markers, but they're right at the side of the circuit. And the reason that's so good is, the closer your braking marker is to the actual circuit or to the car, the better, because you're not having to kind of judge where the braking marker is in relation to the track. Whereas sometimes we see, especially a lot of European circuits or the newer circuits, you get the braking markers. Again, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but you get the braking markers often like up on the fences or quite far away from the track. And the problem with that is you're kind of having to estimate where exactly that brake marker lines up with the track. And then you're kind of be like, okay, I think it's here, and then you're braking. However, if you've got a brake marker that's literally, in the case of the 200 meter board, is legitimately next to the track, then you're going to be really, really consistent. Problem is one, not all tracks are going to have something like this, a really obvious brake marker right next to the circuit. But sometimes you're going to have brake markers. I'll speed this up a little. You're going to have braking zones where you're not braking, like there's no actual reasonable, physical thing like a board in the spot where you need to brake. This corner is a really good example. We're braking roughly here, but we're in between the 2 and the 3. So what do we do to find a consistent brake marker that's close to the track to provide that extra consistency? Depending on what game you're in, some games have like tire marks that are consistent, tire or dirt marks on the actual physical track that are always consistent. Unfortunately, ACC is not really one of those, so we can't rely on those. But what it does have is fairly good graphics off the track, so we can start to pick out things like changes in the color of the dirt or the sand, that kind of thing. The other thing we can start to pick out is little dips in the track. Can you guys see my cursor or not?
I'm not
No.
seeing it.
No.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll just have to be a little bit better at describing it. But basically, as you see, there's a little bit of a kind of a point where that white line that's just to the left of the curbing comes to. Just a little bit. I'll try to line the nose up perfectly here with it. Right there. Basically the dash of the car, the front of where the windshield starts at the bottom of the dash is right where that point is, and I'll back it up just to show you now. So right now it's just ahead of it. That kind of small thing, we'll go ahead here. That kind of small thing, if you can start spotting that at every corner, and you're gonna get used to it too. Like right now, you think, oh, that's really small. Like I don't know if I can pull that out. With practice, you can actually see the point pretty well there now. It's the track dips down a little bit, so it comes to a little bit of a point, so there's an angle in the white line. That kind of thing is going to be much more useful than trying to pick out some, like maybe the green flags waving or one of the posts or even a tree off to the side. I mean, obviously you're not going to be picking those trees, but in other situations at other corners you might be trying to do that because it's your only solid reference, and we're just used to trying to pick out really solid, obvious references. But if we can train ourselves to start picking out smaller things that are still, it has to be usable, right? Like you don't want to be searching for it too much throughout the lap or throughout the laps in your race. But that's the kind of thing that you can start aiming for, and you'll be way more consistent in your braking. So that's basically my little shtick on brake markers. The other thing that I'll say is you generally want to try and have a secondary brake marker. And the reason for that is if you're in a situation where you're behind a car or you're alongside a car and you can't see your normal brake marker. And that's going to be even more the case if you're picking brake markers really close to the car because they're hidden easier. So it then is okay to have kind of a second one more off to the side that is less likely to be hidden by another car that you can kind of bank on if you're in a tight situation and you need another reference to be able to brake at. So it is okay to have that secondary one, but mainly if you're in a clear track, you want to be able to use something as close to the track as possible. And you can start, different people have different preferences in terms of where they like to look. Some people really like to look off into the dirt. Some people like to try and pick out tire marks, or for example, like cuts in the curbing, that kind of thing. But you can go all over the place and pick what feels most comfortable to you, but it's quite important to have specific brake markers. And the other thing I'll say is don't be shy to get really accurate about it. So this is the first corner coming up here is a good example. Like it's really, it would be natural and kind of, I almost want to say lazy to pick the four board here because it's so obvious, it's close to the track, awesome. But is that actually the best place to be braking? Like maybe the best place to be braking is just at the end of the curb here, just ahead of the four board. Or maybe the best place to be braking is right as the dirt begins, right in between the 3 and the 4. So don't be shy to get super accurate with your braking marker because the difference between say you decide, okay, I'm not necessarily going to pick the 4, but the difference between that red, let's go off board a little bit. Beginning at the red and the dirt, if we line the car up, is actually more than a car's length. And looking at it going at full speed, it really doesn't seem like a very big distance at all. But if you can break a full car's length later than your opponent because you're being more accurate about your brake marker, you're only going to win there. So that's about brake markers. Does anybody, before I move on from that, does anybody have any questions? Anything they foresee being a difficulty, tracks they've had trouble with? It's okay if you don't, but I just figured I'd stop right away and ask. Okay, go on.
Oh, yeah, I would say I have less of, I don't know if it's more of a question, more of a clarification, is you were talking about using like dips in the track or like different. So I recall at Donington, that last sort of like chicane before the last couple of
the fast left right.
Yeah. That I found that I was using pretty much the dip of that straightaway as my braking point. So that okay, so that's kind of more like
exactly.
what you're talking about.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing where that dip is close to the car. It's really close to your dashboard or the windscreen basically. And so it's way, way, way easier to pick it out. It's been a while since I've driven Donington, to be honest, but I'm remembering around that brake zone, there's also something off to the right. But if you're able to pick something literally on the track, you're going to be much more consistent every time you get to that braking zone because it's so much easier to line up something directly in front of you or just off to the side rather than something 5, 6, 7 meters off the side of the track. That's the kind of thing because instead of having, you're able to look straight ahead and pick something out rather than having to pay attention to something in your peripheral vision. If that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah, that's a great example of doing that. So sounds good. So I'll move on to. We talked last week about finding what the peak pressure of each car is, or the car you're driving is. What I'm going to talk to you guys about today is how quickly we get to that peak pressure. So it's quite important. And then again, this just to go back to what I briefly introduced in the first clinic was getting, bringing everything to that 100% perfection. This is going to seem quite small, but again, it's the little things added up over all the corners on a lap, over all the laps that really make the difference. But how quickly we get to that peak pressure is quite important. I think a lot of beginner sim racers or people who maybe haven't been taught, we have a tendency of kind of easing on the brakes a little bit, and there's no actual reason to slowly get to your peak pressure unless you're at a corner perhaps like Pouan where it's you're not using very much brake, but brake will really destabilize the car. Another example would be the following corner. So I may actually, I don't know, but we're really not doing a lot of brake pressure. And in cases like that, obviously it doesn't apply as much because we're trying to hold onto the brakes to keep the car controlled. But it's quite important that we get to say 95% brake pressure as quickly as possible, because what happens when you don't is you're losing time all the way to getting to that peak pressure, because rather than doing it in half a second, you're doing it in 7/10 of a second, because it's just less brake pressure. From 0 to 95 is a longer period of time, which means you're going further because you don't have as much brake pressure on. And I did do a visual representation of this. I just have to find it. Let's just see here. Yeah, so this is quite a drastic example, but watch the brake pressure here. It's kind of lazy initially, and we go pretty far into the braking zone. Let's just back that up. Stop it. Stop. Just to show you where we end up. But that would be example of lazy braking. You're not really paying attention. You're not getting right to that 100%. And kind of same drill as last week. We'll count from the white, but 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half, let's say. curbs lengths away. And then I think, let's go back. Then if we go to, did I get it right this lap or not? If we go to getting, again, just so you guys can watch how quickly we get to the peak pressure there. Now we actually love it. I actually might have been trying to demonstrate something different there already, but here, let's try. I think it might have been this one. If we get to 100% pressure much quicker, so it was the lap before, sorry. There we go. If we get to it much quicker, we're going to stop a lot quicker, just because we have more pressure quicker. You already see just visually there. But we get to more pressure quicker, so we're stopping quicker. And if we do that again at every corner, we're going to save up time over the lap. So that's another small thing that we do while braking to get to. We just want to get to that peak elevation or peak brake pressure as quickly as we possibly can. Anybody have questions on that?
So for braking, I guess to put it another way, like if you're trying to punch a punching bag, you don't want to ease your hand into the punching bag and push it. You actually want to hit it really hard and quick to get the maximum force onto it. I guess that's
exactly. That's a really good way of putting it. And actually, what I'll say here, or should I say it here, or am I going to say it after? No, I'll say it after, because there is actually a technique that I'll be bringing up after this that goes to exactly that point. So, yeah. Okay. Now I think I'll talk about a few different techniques that we have. So I'm just going to remind myself here. Elevation change. Okay, perfect. So the first one I'm going to talk about, actually, you know what? Let's just go straight into it. That talk of punching a punching bag versus slowly squeezing into it is a really good metaphor. And we can actually use it, again, to talk about pressing less on the brakes. So what I mean by that is when we're trying to get to our peak pressure, we're not the idea isn't to smash our way through the brake pedal. So don't think I see some people braking and I swear what they're doing is they're lifting their foot off the brake and then literally kicking through it, which we really don't want to do. And the reason for that is we cannot be accurate that way. If you try to apply the same force and stop at the exact same spot in your brake pressure and your actual physical travel in your brake by kicking it, you'll never get it right. So what we want to do instead is constantly have our foot on the brake pedal and then squeeze into the brake pedal to our maximum pressure. Now, we're still going to squeeze hard, but what we're doing is we're training the muscles in our leg and our memory to always squeeze hard to the same pressure and then release that pressure. And the important difference is there, one, we're not having to guess at how hard to kick through the pedal, but two, and probably more importantly, we're also, it's much easier to release that pressure if you've squeezed rather than kicking, because if you kick right, then you're going through it and then you have to start releasing, and releasing a kick doesn't really even make sense to your brain because it just doesn't work. It's kind of a uniform motion. You're only going forward. But if you squeeze, there's that kind of, the compression of a spring, and then the compression of a spring, there's always that kind of reaction where it goes back out to its normal spot. And what we're doing is we're turning our legs and our foot into the spring. So what we're trying to do is we're creating that tension in the brake itself all the way to the maximum quite quickly again, but then we get to release way more slowly, and that's going to help a ton with your brake control. And actually I'll move quickly into a kind of side note about this. One really good way of training yourselves to more accurately get to your peak pressure and then slowly get back down to your, say your trail braking pressure, is before you go out, like every time before you go out to practice, pull up your whatever brake set you have and train yourself to have your foot on the pedal go all the way to the maximum percentage, because it is a percentage in the end, or pressure if you've got a load cell, but it's still going to show you percentage of the max peak pressure of the car, and then train your leg and your muscles to be able to release that pressure 1% at a time. And it's going to be really difficult initially. Your leg is probably going to be shaking. You're probably going to be dropping 5-10%, especially at the top, for those of you with a load cell, at the top end of the pressure, because you're having to put a lot. But then slowly you'll start to notice as you get, down to 60 and 50, it's going to be easier to control that release of pressure by 1%. And continue to do that. It's not going to happen, it's not even going to happen in the first week or the first 2 weeks. It's really going to take some time, but eventually you will have trained your mind and your leg muscles to be able to brake really accurately quite quickly up to a certain percentage, and then be able to control that percentage as you release the brake. And kind of a side note on that is, what we're doing is, it's important that we have ourselves set up right. There's a lot of actual, like, your rig setup videos, but it's important to remember that there's really only two important points in your body for when we're braking, and that's on your foot and basically in your back, right at your hip. You shouldn't be forcing the brake down or into the travel from anywhere in between those two places. I mean, obviously the force is coming from your leg, but what we don't want to be doing specifically is using either your ankle and your foot to kind of press down, and we don't want to be using the knee either as a lever. We want to be pushing, basically, we want to be pushing the brake through from the quad, but that pressure point is basically in the back, against the back of your seat, and then obviously the pressure of your foot on the pedal. And if you think of it like that, it's way easier to control that whole process. This isn't something that I have mastered yet, but and you have to practice it slowly. But that's definitely going to be able. You'll be way more consistent. So rather than kind of the really important thing is to try and not to just use your ankle and the top of your foot as a lever. You want to be using your whole leg. And actually, JD, you've become extremely consistent and smooth on the brake. So if you have anything to add to that, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, just like you're saying, like, it's important to use your whole leg and to have the proper ergonomics in your rig. Because before my current setup with a wheel stand, my pedal placement wasn't very good, so I was very inconsistent with how I was applying my brakes. So getting the ergonomics and actually getting that you're using your whole leg to brakes is very important. That also helps with the consistency of letting off for trail braking. Braking is the most important part of driving, in my opinion. Like, this is when people say, like, oh, a set of pedals is worth time. That's what they mean, like, because that's where you gain time. You don't gain time on track by not necessarily braking later, but braking more effectively than everyone else. So
yeah, working
on that is the most important part, and having ergonomics so you can apply the pressure correctly. That's immense. So
yeah, exactly. And a final note on that, maybe just to put it in a slightly different way, is to say, like, rather than, especially on the release of the brake, because a lot of us think about, so, you brake and then you're immediately thinking about releasing to start trail braking, and that causes multiple problems. One of them being that you're shifting the weight of the car from being quite on the front two wheels. When you brake hard, obviously everything shifts forward, and then if we release quickly, because we're trying to get to the trail braking stage, what happens is all the weight moves to the back of the car, and then you don't have much grip to turn, but also the less smooth you are in that motion, the less accurate you're going to be in the trail braking itself. So what we're really wanting to aim for is hard to your max pressure, but accurately, and then a very constant and smooth release of the brakes all the way to your trail braking phase. Because there's technically 3 phases. There's your braking to stop, there's your trail braking, which is actually to turn the car, and then there's the portion in the middle, which is your transition from stopping to trail braking. And that's the part that needs to be smooth, not simply drop off to your 5 or 10% trail braking. And that's, to me, that's been the hardest part to master, because most of us can brake hard and most of us can trail brake at 5 to 10%. But it's that smooth release to the trail braking that's really difficult to master. And one good way of thinking about it is what you're doing is you're releasing the pressure in your leg and foot that you feel, when you press hard into the brake and you feel it in your back. A good way of thinking about it is not releasing that pressure, but what you're simply doing is you're not releasing the brake. What you're doing is reducing the pressure in your leg. Because if you're reducing the pressure in the leg, that the brake pedal is slowly going to start coming back to you. And that's where that real smoothness comes from. So yeah, that's a little bit more about how we apply the brakes and begin to start to enter that turning phase of the corner. That was a lot of info. Anybody have any questions?
I can put something to that if you have just a moment.
Oh yeah, go on.
Okay. Normally, I tell the guys when they are looking to see if their pedals and that sort of thing are working properly, I always tell them to go into the controls section, and you can actually do the similar thing that you were talking about, where you apply the brake, and I tell them to hold it for 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And then just release the muscles in your leg. Don't literally lift your foot. You want to just relax your muscles and try and make that red line on the brake line go back as slowly as possible. And that will help you to understand how smooth and how slowly you can actually let that red line drop off down to the lower end of the pressure, like you were talking about for actual trail braking.
Yeah, exactly. That's 100% right. That's exactly the way to do it. Is you're decompressing the spring. You're not releasing it. The other thing too is it also helps you to know that your pedals are working properly before you start a practice session. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I heard someone else potentially speak up. Did someone else have a question?
That was Fernando, I believe. Sorry about that.
Yes, don't worry. I have 2 questions. Is there a way to put the throttle and brake slice indicator in the middle of the screen? I'm having a hard time to find out how much pressure I'm putting on the brake.
You can actually move that under the HUD setting. Let me see if I can find it in the game. Go ahead and with whatever you're talking about, Josiah, and I'll find that for him in a second.
Yeah, there is a way to do it. Anyway, Larry will find it.
Okay.
Go on for your second one. Yeah.
If I'm hearing the ABS putting too much, is that I am delaying the brake too much?
If you're hearing the ABS engage too much, it's one of 2 issues. Either you're braking too hard. For one of 2 issues. It could be a ton of issues, but if you're hearing it a lot, either you're braking just slightly too hard because basically the car would be locking up if it weren't for the ABS, or the ABS is turned on too high, which means that it constantly wants to cut in. Kind of like if you have your traction control too high and there's actually more grip in the car, but the traction control is constantly trying to interfere and stop the car sliding, even though you're not actually that close to it. So it's kind of a balancing act. I would say that if your ABS is only halfway up, say in this car we've got 11, so if your ABS is only at 6, even up to 7, and you're still having that issue, I would say try reducing your peak pressure. So don't go all the way to 100 if that's where you're at. Maybe only go to 95 or go to 93. Don't reduce it too much, but just reduce it by a little bit. And then if the ABS is only cutting in a little bit in the corner, then you've arrived at the right spot.
Okay, thank you. Yes, because at this moment when I hear the ABS, the first I think is I'm delaying too much the brake zone. So if it weren't for the ABS, I weren't locking my brakes.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's what the ABS is for, is to not lock the brakes. Now, if you're trying to brake at a certain point and you can't make the corner, so if you're trying two things basically, if you're braking really hard and your ABS is cutting in a bunch and you're still making the corner, that tells you can brake probably a little bit later, or at least at the same spot, and just not brake quite as hard, and you'll stop a little bit earlier and be able to turn in earlier. However, if you can't brake at whatever spot you're trying to brake at without the ABS cutting in massively, and then when you try and fix that, you still can't brake there, that means you need to back up your braking zone a little bit. So there's a few things in there, and if you want, I can go over it with you individually as well and just see what's happening. But that's the basics behind figuring out what's going on with ABS.
Okay, I did find what I was looking for, Fernando. I dropped a picture of it in your DM, sir. Now, just for those who don't actually have the picture that I sent, if you look in the options and you go to HUD, you can actually go to the very top of the screen. The first one says scale, which is the overall size of each one of the portions of the HUD. And then there's the left and there's the right side. You would use the right margin, and the higher the number, the more towards the center the screen will take. The right side of the HUD will move over. Now, this is not an individual part. It's the whole right side of the HUD will move across the screen. You can actually switch sides if you really wanted to, but you could actually move it over to where it's easier to see it if you wanted to, depending on your screen, and you can adjust the numbers on your own. But yeah, you would use the margin numbers, which are the first two that I marked in the picture for you, Fernando, and that'll help you move the right side closer to the center.
Yes, I saw the picture. Thank you.
No worries.
The other thing I'll say is I don't honestly know this for myself, but I have seen, I think there may be a third-party app.
Armamentero. I have it if anybody wants it.
Okay.
Yeah, that app is... Sorry, Josiah and Larry. Yeah, that app is brilliant. Larry sent it to me the other day. It gives you a whole set of new features. It's brilliant. Larry, thank you for it.
On the screen.
Yeah, it allows you to move things around, even damage indicator. It's got a fuel calculator in it. Everything you could ever actually need extra.
Yeah, so there you go. So you'll be actually able to move that around for you. Apologies for the dog. But yeah, that you can do the third-party app that'll be able to do that, so you wouldn't have to move your whole HUD if you don't want to. Moving on to the next topic, it still involves braking, although this time it's not actually anything we're doing on the brakes. It's another kind of small change that's going to take some time to implement, but it's about not holding the steering wheel too tight. And I'm going to explain why, and we'll talk about it a little bit in other portions of the corner, so a little bit later in the cornering phase. But in the braking phase, there's an actual physical reason why we don't want to hold the brake too tight, and that is that if you're holding the steering wheel tight as you brake, what's going to happen is you're basically locking the steering rack. Everybody know what I mean by that? Like the tires have to fight a force to actually rotate. You guys understand what I'm saying?
You mean the angle of how much you're turning? Is that what you're meaning?
No, I mean the physical. So, you're holding the steering wheel tight, and you start to brake.
Physically squeezing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that tends to be just because we're preparing to go into the corner. your muscles are tensing up because you know you're about to rotate the wheel. So there's a whole host of reasons why kind of naturally we want to grab the wheel tight, but we tend to firm up a little bit as we go into the corner on the steering wheel. And what it does physically to the car is that doesn't allow the wheels to turn until we actually begin to rotate the wheel.
I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah.
And so what happens when we do that is it naturally, when you go to brake in a car, there's a centering force on the steering rack that causes the wheels to basically align and go completely straight. But if we're holding the steering wheel too tight, what happens is we're counteracting that natural centering force that the braking has on the steering rack and the front wheels. And even though we may think we're holding the steering wheel completely straight, we're probably not. There's probably some, very micro variations, especially as we go through the corner, to what's happening to our hands. And so you're basically holding the car in a position that's slightly unnatural. And I'm going to blow it up to a really extreme case. What happens if we rotate the wheel 45 or 90 degrees and try to brake? Just shout it out.
You're going to understeer or skid, one of the two.
There we go, skid. So the reason for that is you're trying to turn a whole ton, and you're also trying to brake, and there's nowhere near enough grip to be able to do that. Well, what happens when you're holding the steering wheel too tight is a very, very, very small portion of that. You're still trying to brake while the tires are turning slightly. They're not being allowed to pull in their natural direction. So what happens is we're actually taking brake performance out of the car and the tires by holding the steering wheel too tight. So what we want to do as we go through, and this really applies especially in hard braking zones, is we want to go really light in our grip of the steering wheel. And what that's going to allow the car to do is actually straighten itself out naturally and be able to brake more without engaging the ABS or locking. And as you start to, the harder you brake, the more you want to let go of the wheel, almost let your hands go limp. And it seems really weird, but you'll actually notice that the car stops better because you're not holding the front wheels in that tight position ready to turn the wheel. You're allowing the car to naturally center itself out and slow down, and you'll actually notice you start to feel the force feedback a little bit better, so you actually get a little bit better feeling throughout the corner. So that's one really important thing. It's really hard to do because it's not immediately obvious, unless you're in a car with no ABS, like the Cup car. If you really want to feel this, go in the Cup car and go to a track with an extremely hard braking zone and really hold on that steering wheel pressure, especially if there's a slight curve in the corner as you're braking, and then do it with really light hands, and you'll notice it. But that's another small technique to start to try and work into your practice, to be able to keep that just a little bit extra grip in the tires, to improve your braking performance. Questions about that? Because I know that one can be a little bit harder to understand.
Don't have a death grip on the wheel.
Yeah, exactly. It also helps with soreness in the hands, but yeah.
Not only that, I would also say that if nothing else, you're more apt to be able to get the rotation of your hands proper if your hands aren't massively stiff. And as you try and rotate the wheel, there's more flexibility in your muscles. Really, you shouldn't be having a death grip on the wheel to begin with. Mm-hmm. And it literally will make it easier, not only like you said in the long run of your hands being stiff and sore and that sort of thing, but you'll feel more in the force feedback. Even with the lower end wheels, you'll have more fine things that you'll start to feel. You might even feel little dips in the track and that sort of thing without the very, very harsh, death grip or stranglehold on the steering wheel.
Yeah, exactly. And if you guys want to, if you truly want to practice this, what I would do and actually, I'd say Laguna is probably a pretty good one, although it lacks some really super hard braking zones. There's a couple, but not many. What I would do is like literally go out on the track and almost let your hands go limp at every corner, and slowly get the feeling of doing that kind of just naturally. Or even if you want to do that, say on the first 5-6 laps of your practice run, or at some point in your practice, and just get used to that feeling. And what you want it to become second nature. So you're not thinking about how it really works. You're not thinking about having to do it. It just becomes a little bit more natural. And that that'll take you'll save some time on your lap. The last thing I'll talk about today is I'm just going to go over brake bias a little bit more, and add a few things that I didn't say last week. So a quick run through again of the real basics of brake bias. So more brake bias more towards the front of the car, so that's more of a percentage of your brake power being sent to the front wheels, will basically provide a more stable car generally, but you're more stable under braking, but you're more likely to lock up the front tires, and you generally have, because most cars tend to have a slight bias at least to the front brakes, you're not stopping quite as quickly. Then the more you move the brake bias rearward, the less likely you are to lock your front tires, but generally the car is going to become more unstable, because as you add brake bias towards the rear of the car, what starts to happen is you're asking the rear tires for more grip, and if when you exceed that grip, what they want to do is they're going to start sliding, and basically they can't stop as quickly as the front end of the car is stopping, and they then try and overtake the front end basically. So imagine, I don't know, I kind of think of it in a funny way, but it's just, imagine two people running the same race, and then you've got the rear of the car that's running trying to run the race quicker because it can't stop as quickly, and then the only thing for it to do is to swing around. If you get it in the right spot, it does tend to slow down a little bit quicker, because you have that brake bias a little bit more equalized, and it does generally provide, well, not generally, it does actually provide more grip to the front tires when you're trail braking. So what you see a lot of people doing, especially the pros, is they'll run the car with as much rearward bias as they can without having it too unstable. And there are a few things to consider though. So whichever way you run the brake bias, either more rearward or more frontward, if you have it more towards the front, you're heating up the surface of the tire more in the front or more in the rear. You're going to heat it up more in the rear. And this is getting like extremely technical. I don't change my brake bias per corner. I might change it throughout the stint, especially, depending what car you drive. The Porsche is a great example, obviously, if the fuel's coming out of the front of the car. So as the fuel comes out, then the front goes a lot lighter, so you don't have as much grip on the front. So generally what you want to do is you're going to move the brake bias more rearward as the stint goes on to help with the turn-in. So it really depends on what car you're driving, but it is good to keep in mind that if you're really running an aggressive brake bias, either front or rear, you're heating up that axle more than the other. So let's say you're running a lot of rearward bias, but you want a really good run out of the corner. NASRS is a good example. So heavy braking zone into T1 at Spa. If you're running a lot of rearward bias, you've heated up the surface of the rear tires going into that corner, and then when you're trying to lean on them to get a good exit, they're already hot, and so you're not going to get as much grip. I would say in ACC that it's not as much of a consideration as it perhaps is in some other very tire sensitive or tire temperature sensitive games, cough, iRacing. but it is something to keep in mind. The other thing is, it's always a balance. So you may have a brake bias that works quite well in a stable corner, a heavy braking zone, and a turn-in where it's very low speed. But if you're experiencing it somewhere, and I actually tried to show it here a little bit, I think it may have been here. Let's go on board. I was kind of basically trying to show some understeer. So if you're getting understeer in the corner, which I did here, I kind of missed the apex, and it wasn't perfect. One remedy to that is to say, okay, I'll bring the brake bias rearward a little bit, and what that's going to do is it's going to just make the rear end of the car a little bit looser, so your initial turn-in should be better, but you're also going to have more grip when you're trail braking. So I think I ended up getting it somewhere around here. So this, just to let you know, I think I started out with like 64.4 brake bias, and I moved it down to 60. And you should see me clip the apex a lot better. See, just there, and then I think, sort of. The initial apex was good, second half a little brilliant, but you get the idea, is you're playing with the brake bias to have a good balance throughout the lap. Now, the really, really good drivers probably are adjusting brake bias per corner, but I wouldn't worry about that yet. I would get down to the basics, understand how it works, figure out something that works throughout the entire lap, and if you're having trouble at a corner with understeer, before going and changing a ton of settings in the car and worrying about your anti-roll bars and your preload and all that, just maybe give it a shot and drop, move the brake bias a little bit rearward and see if that helps you. And that's one good trick, especially if you're in the race, right? You can't change your setup during the race, but hey, maybe I can adjust my brake bias and help the car with what's ailing it at that point. So yeah, that's actually all I had for today. I didn't want it to run too long, although I've almost done an hour already. But does anybody have questions on the brake bias or anything I talked about earlier? Or anything else for that matter. If you guys are struggling with anything you're practicing with, I'd be happy to help as well.
Things I try to tell these guys is when it comes to the brake bias, it's kind of a personal number, if you really want to call it that, because whatever you're comfortable with as far as setting it is pretty much spot on to where you need to run it while you're driving the car. I mean, you could experiment with it, moving it forward, moving it backward, that sort of thing. But it's one of those things, once you get to a good, comfortable place and you know the car is going to stop well, you could, I wouldn't say change it too much per track, but there might be some instances where you need a little bit more towards the front on a particular track, or you may need to move it back just a little bit more on a particular track or that sort of thing. I know with the Ferrari, the non-Evo Ferrari, I think most of the setups on that one shows it at almost 60%. And I can actually run it back to 55, and the car actually stops a lot smoother and a lot straighter and in a shorter distance most places.
Yeah. That's a really good example of just like what happens when you start out with a brake bias that's very far forward, and then bring it back closer to 50%. And basically, generally what happens is you're able to, as Larry said, you're able to stop sooner just because you're using more of the actual full braking potential of the car. So yeah, that exactly. And his Larry's point about finding a general area where you're able to consistently brake and it performs well is a really good point. Like, it's not like you're going to have massive changes in the same car at different tracks. Some tracks with very difficult corners, again, I kind of always go back to Pouan with Spa, are going to require maybe a little bit of a change because it really induces some instability in the car, so you might have to account for that. But it's true that, generally, and most cars are going to have an optimal spot. So let's say in the Ferrari, for sake of argument, it's 55. You're pretty safe to bring it to the, if you found that you can consistently brake there with good performance at 55 brake bias, well, you can go to the next track and pretty much bump that in right away, and you'll be pretty close to what you need.
If nobody knows what the Pouan corner is at Spa, there's ACC track maps just above the coaching room here, and you can find it.
Yeah, it's the long left-hander midway through the lap that usually has you spinning around. But yeah, so that's pretty much brake bias in a nutshell. It's a little bit voodoo and does take some time to really figure out properly. But that's the basic idea behind it. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Not to change the subject, but I just thought of this also because of the track maps. And does anybody here do any kind of, I would say, artwork to a certain extent that would look like what we have as far as